If you have taught any adult students, you will come across many different technique issues that you don't have with other students, right? They have different needs and different anatomies and different habits than our younger students do. So in this video, we're going to go through 4 different technique issues that are really common among adult students that I have seen again and again with my own adult students as I've taught them through the years. And I'm going to give you solutions to each of those. But these aren't the only things that can come up, so make sure to add yours in the comments because I would love to hear what issues you come across with your adult students, and hopefully I can help you to solve them. The first issue that I see with many of my adult students is frozen wrists. Have any of you had this? Their wrists are stuck, and in fact they're often stuck down here. Even if they're at that nice line, they tend to get frozen that way. It can be really hard to get our adult students to do things like wrist lift-offs. If you're having this trouble with adult students, know that you are not alone at all. This is a tricky issue, and adults do get frozen in certain positions. You know, we're typing on keyboards all day, or depending on what they do for a profession, they build up these habits. So to unstick my adult students' wrists, I do work more with them than I would with other ages of students on things like simple 2-note slur patterns, going from this note to that note and practicing that wrist lift off. Because although they don't always get the wrist movement that easily, they really need it to bring their pieces to life in the way they normally want to. They often are the first to hear that their music sounds abrupt or it doesn't sound quite right, and often the frozen wrist is the key to this in my experience. So getting them to do more of those 2-note slur exercises, also doing them on a tabletop. So lift off from the wrist on a tabletop rather than on the piano. A lot of that tension that they get often comes from the expectation they have for themselves when they're at the piano. So getting them to do it on a tabletop is a great thing, and also getting them to listen carefully to the effect that has on playing. So getting them to close their eyes in the lesson while you do those wrist lift-offs so that they can hear that tapered ending to the sound and the effect it has, so that they know what they're listening for. Use the fact that they're an adult as an advantage so that you can really get them to hone in on what it is they're after in a way that a kid maybe couldn't do. The second issue I see over and over again with my adult students is overlapping legato. Have you heard this in your adult students? I find that they'll hold down one note and the next note at the same time. They don't quite get their fingers off the keys in time, essentially. This produces this muddy sound. It's not really legato. They know something is wrong with the sound, but they can't seem to be able to fix it at all times. For me, there are several possible solutions to this. The first one is to use a different form of legato that in Piano Safari they would call tree frog technique. And yes, I sometimes use these silly names with my adult students. I don't find that it bothers them if I go into it with a sense of fun. So tree frog technique is the bouncy legato. Some people call it nudgy legato, where you're bouncing from the wrist to get into different notes. This might also have the benefit of unfreezing their wrists that we talked about previously. This doesn't work for all adult students, but for the ones that it does, it's a very helpful step in getting them towards that smooth style of playing. Another solution is to make sure that their wrist is at the right height. So I talked now about bouncing the wrist, and now I'm telling you to make sure it's at the right height. We don't want it frozen, but we do want to make sure that that's not what the issue is, because often adult students do have a habit of dropping their wrist down like that, down really low. And when you do that, you're stretching your arm. You don't have all the mobility that you have if you have a straighter line or a more parallel to the floor kind of shape. So making sure their wrist is the right height is a great little troubleshooting tip for that overlapping legato technique. And the last one, again, is listening. They need to be able to hear the difference. If they can't hear when it's overlapping versus not, they're not going to make any headway because when they practice at home, it's not going to sound right. The fourth issue that I see a lot with adult students is what we're going to call the crouch and crumple. Do you have any adults that do this? I'm talking about the students who tuck themselves in on the bench right into the piano and seem to retract themselves as much as possible down so that they don't take up any extra space. I think a lot of this comes from insecurities they have at being an adult student, being a beginner, not feeling confident sitting at the piano. But we need to get them to make that nice tripod shape. We need to get them to have that stable base and to move the bench back. The number one thing I see make a difference with this is showing them. And not just showing them like, this is how you sit one time, but over and over again, sitting down at a second piano beside them, or if you don't have one, just swapping places with them, sitting down and showing them how much you have to move the bench back from where they had it. And you're probably at roughly the same height, or point out the height difference and the effect that that has. Planting your feet wide, sitting on the edge of the bench, showing them how that actually looked and feels, and then get them to try it and feel how much more stable they are. Another thing that's very helpful for this is just forcing them out of it. If you're playing pieces that use the full range of the keyboard, you can't tuck yourself in. You can't crouch and crumple because you won't be able to reach everything. So right from the start, getting your beginner adult students to play rote pieces and do improvisations that go all over the range of the keyboard is really good for combating this. If they have to go down low and up high and they get used to that, they'll get used to untucking the bench because it is impossible to stretch side to side when you're tucked right in like that. The fourth and final common technique woe that I see with my adult students is what I'll call the fifth fall down, which is when your fifth finger pulls your hand down. Have you seen this before? I know I have this with many of my older adult students, and it's because their fifth finger, it only goes straight. And so when they get to it, they tend to play with the whole side of their finger. And as someone with hypermobility in my hands, I get it. That classical round or rounded or slightly curved piano hand shape just isn't always suitable, especially if you've been playing or doing other things for your whole life and you have habits that you're not going to break at this stage or are going to take a long time to break. So for the fifth fall down, when your fifth finger is pulling your hand down and rocking everything up, the best thing I find is to have a little bit of a compromise on what you think is perfect. Yep, my fifth finger does curve, but maybe theirs doesn't, and that's their hand, and we need to work with what they have. So having the fifth and fourth finger stand tall rather than curve is often a great little modification that makes a big difference. Another thing is to talk to your adult students about rotation. Often they're not putting their weight behind the finger enough to be able to support it. And if they're all the way over with their weight over the other side of their hand, playing with the fifth finger, it's going to cause their hand to fall down in that way. Okay, I said I had 4 tips for you, but here is a little bonus. Tip number 5, our bonus tip, is your home accent. What do I mean by that? We often talk with our younger students about making sure that the parents have a good home setup for their kiddo. But what about your adults? How much do you make sure that their home instrument is actually up to snuff? A lot of us can be a bit timid about doing this because we feel like we're overstepping some mark, right? We're dictating how they spend their money or what their priorities should be, but you're not. This is part of educating them. If you have an adult beginner student, they do not know that their unweighted keyboard sitting on the floor or on their dining room table is doing them harm, and you have to educate them on that fact. So don't underestimate the home instrument factor for your adults too, especially if you've got that legato issue or any of those kinds of issues going on. Check out what's happening at home. That might be the solution.